Hello, learners, and welcome back to this NPTEL course on Victorian literature. As promised, in this lecture, I will wrap up the discussion of the important social, cultural, as well as economic changes that took place in the 1890s, an important decade in Victorian England, and a crucial and fundamental decade for students of some key texts in Victorian literature. In the previous lecture, I had begun talking about a contrast between two views on the new journalism. One sort of view is best represented by Matthew Arnold, who describes the popularity of newspapers and magazines as a bad thing and attributes this to the growing and democratic development in which people less educated than himself were empowered to demand new kinds of writing. On the other hand, however, we have another, a more optimistic, more hopeful, and ultimately more productive view of the popularity of the printing press, and this is represented by W.T. Stead, the editor of a very popular newspaper in Victorian England. Here is a quote from Mr. Stead. "The telegraph and the printing press have converted Great Britain into a vast agora, or assembly of the whole community, in which the discussion of the affairs of state is carried on from day to day in the hearing of the whole people. At the same time, an enterprising editor could shape and direct such discussion to an unprecedented extent. The editorial pen is a scepter of power, compared with which the scepter of many a monarch is but a gilded lath." So, in these words, we can see how Stead imagines the role of the editor of popular periodical, of something that a lot of people read on a very frequent basis. The editor of newspaper or a magazine is compared to a government, a monarch, or a leader. And even though the editor does not have legislative powers, because of the frequency and the pervasiveness with which the editor can change the views of a large number of people, the editor actually effectively becomes more powerful than a monarch. This kind of legislation through journalism was practiced by many editors, and many of whom also began to have a pernicious influence, unlike Stead. Let us try and understand some of these influences. The type of writing that Stead encouraged and published had very important social consequences. In one instance, at least, Stead's ideal of government by journalism seemed close to realization. "The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon," this is the title of a story, which Stead published. This was Stead's expose of white slavery trade in underage London girls. This story spurred a public outcry that led directly to the passing of a law, the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885. On one hand, it looks like journalism has done its job of producing necessary and effective legislation. On closer inspection, however, one finds, and if understood in its full social context, we can see that Arnold's suspicions were not unfounded. The careers of writers both began from and were undermined by the growing popularity of newspapers and the kind of sensationalist writing they encouraged. Now, from our perspective, and with the hindsight of both time as well as the insight of scholarship, the 1885 Act, which I just named, looks, to be sure, both well-intentioned and featherbrained. On one hand, it was designed to advance the cause of social purity by raising the age of consent for girls and regulating a range of non-marital sexual relations. In practice, however, the act was used primarily to harass and sometimes to prosecute working-class women and homosexual men. And it's interesting to note that among the most famous victims of this well-intentioned but poorly executed law was Oscar Wilde, who was convicted in the year 1895 of acts of gross indecency and with other men, and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. This conviction not only destroyed Wilde's career, He died in the year 1900, aged only 46, but also drove underground for at least two more generations, a burgeoning gay culture in London. So it's important to note how journalism had important social consequences. It certainly had very noble intentions. It had very noble ambitions. However, in many cases, in the manner in which it was implemented, it often produced effects which were far from desirable. And it's also important to note how writers like Oscar Wilde had very complicated relationship to this growing popularity of newspapers, popular media, and popular periodical writing. On one hand, such newspapers and magazines were instrumental to the careers of these writers. As we will note, both Oscar Wilde and Bram Stoker, the two writers that I will discuss, as well as Stevenson, the other writer in this course, began their careers by publishing in the popular press. However, as we just saw, it was the popular press itself which, through its sensationalist style of writing and alarmist, panic creating, and fear mongering style of reportage, also led to laws which were misused to harass a lot of working class people and especially homosexual men, and which ultimately led to the literary as well as physical demise of Oscar Wilde. So, this is a very important development, the power of this popular press in the late 19th century. It's important to remember that despite its many flaws, the new journalism became an undeniable and an unstoppable force in Victorian England. No high culture writer of the late Victorian period was able to shape public discourse in the way Stead and other new journalists like T.P. O'Connor and H.W. Massingham did. The problem, as press accounts of the Maiden Tribute affair and 3 years later other famous murders, including the Jack the Ripper murder stories, amply showed, was the ease with which social activism turned into sensationalism, and at that point, the potential for social reform began to die out almost completely. By the mid 1890s, even Stead's journalism seemed restrained in comparison to some other newer, more sensationalist forms of writing, such as Alfred Harmsworth's Daily Mail. It became the most sensational, and with a circulation of more than 500,000 in the year 1898, the most widely read periodical in England. So you can see what that shows about the changing reading public in this nation. The most widely read periodical is a sensational newspaper, right? People want to be entertained. People want short-term, low-stakes entertainment. And there are writers and editors willing to produce writing which can supply that demand, which can meet that need. Motivating much of the criticism directed at the new journalists was the fear many felt at the expansion of the reading public. The reading public was expanding, not only because people had money to buy, but also because more and more people had the ability to read. The Education Act of 1870 had made elementary education compulsory in England and Wales. Scotland had already had such a law much before. As a result, literacy rates rose steadily, although nowhere near at the rate imagined by alarmed observers who feared the prospect of a half-educated public engaged, as Frederick Harrison put it, in aimless, promiscuous, vapid reading, or worse, the poisonous inhalation of mere literary garbage and bad men's worst thoughts. Now, a key instance where these anxieties was Tennyson's funeral, and the thoughts that this funeral sparked, and the reportage of this funeral, the thoughts that this sparked in the minds of the writer and critic Edmund Gosse. Learners, you will remember the name Edmund Gosse from previous lectures. This was the critic who discovered the work of the Indian, English, Bengali female poet Toru Dutt, and it was his introductory memoir from which I had quoted in order to help frame the discussion of Toru Dutt's sonnet. Now, the same Edmund Gosse, now attending Tennyson's funeral, in the year 1892 was made uneasy by the spectacle of what he called the unparalleled masses of the curious, unquote, crowding around Westminster Abbey. These masses, Gossi wrote later, had turned out not to honor Tennyson the poet, but instead to ogle what remained of Tennyson the celebrity. And thanks to the vulgarizing influences of the mass media, the ancient prestige of verse had given way to a modern cult of personality. Few in the crowd had either the taste or the training necessary for a true appreciation of poetry, Gossi surmised, and he worried that public opinion would pressure the government to choose a new laureate based on mere commercial success rather than literary merit. So, this was the concern that as more and more people become literate, merely able to read English language, not necessarily appreciate literary value, the literary sphere would decline, right? And this marks a very important development in the literary history of Victorian era. The penny paper, the mass market periodical, the music hall, popular theatre, like the variety and the burlesque, and finally the theatre and the cinema, these were signs for many serious senior observers that a radical split had opened up between the genteel and the popular culture. The masses, who were now enfranchised and educated, also happened to be largely uninterested in the rare or delicate or abstruse, were seeking their own forms of cultural expression. So there is a great deal of democratization of literary production, and writers respond to this democratization with increasing levels of complexity. Some writers celebrate it, some writers criticize it, some writers shrink away from this democratization. They see it as the beginning of the end, whereas some writers embrace it. They write new kinds of stories. And we will read two such new kinds of stories in The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde and Dracula by Bram Stoker. This was also the time when writing became more and more professional. There were groups that were designed to help young writers, beginning writers, writers new to the publishing world, design a career, gain success, and sustain themselves. This was also a time when little magazines, which would be all the rage in the early 20th century, began to make their appearance. It is usually considered that little magazines created modernism, but it's not as well known that little magazines actually began their career in the late Victorian era. A famous literary magazine was the Yellow Book. In this magazine, Henry James published a story titled The Death of the Lion. This story demonstrates very clearly the relationship between literary value, financial ambition, and profit. In this story, which is about a writer named Faraday, James describes a fatal encounter with the forces of mass culture. James stages a familiar confrontation between art and commerce, but it does so in such a way that the distinction between the two terms finally makes no sense. At the heart of the tale is a sacred text, Faraday's manuscript notes for an as yet unwritten novel. No one can adequately appreciate its artistry yet, or perhaps we should say, and so it becomes the basis of his celebrity. Precisely because the book is too beautiful to read, it acquires the aura that makes for commercial success. It's important to note that Faraday becomes a public figure by shunning publicity. His financial success stems from a sincere disregard for money. And so, in this gesture, by gaining financial success from a desire not to gain financial success or from a desire for artistic integrity, James describes a characteristically turn-of-the-century persona, also known as a fin de siècle persona, the turn of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. As a term, the fin de siècle is used to describe a complex set of intellectual, cultural, historical, as well as philosophical changes that occurred in the writing of literature as well as the production of culture in the late 19th and the early 20th century. This gesture would be adopted and further refined by the rising generation of the modernists. In practice, however, the disdain for the marketplace could be indulged only by writers like James, whose commercial sense was sufficiently shrewd. For the less shrewd, that is to say, for most ordinary writers, help was available in the form of the Society of Authors. This was a group founded by Walter Besant, and the goal of the society was to spread abroad and to cultivate among writers the knowledge of the reality of literary property by throwing a flood of light upon all those matters connected with the literary trade, which have hitherto been kept mysteriously dark and secret, namely matters of economics and trade. Now, as we can see, this was also a time when, in addition to the rise of popular press, there was also a growing awareness of the necessity of financial sustainability to the production of literature. This was also a time when a lot of hostility began to rise towards women writers and towards a kind of writing which was known as the New Woman novel. The New Woman novel featured protagonists who were described with this phrase, the New Woman. This woman was typically portrayed as self-reliant, adventuresome, outspoken, and intelligent. As such, this character affronted conventional notions of femininity. By contrast, the novels in which she appeared tended, formally speaking, to be quite conventional. As developed by writers like Sarah Grant, Mona Cade, Ella Hepworth Dixon, Olive Schreiner, Emma Brooke, and Gertrude Dix, the New Woman novel represents a late flowering of two highly respectable Victorian forms. First, the social problem novel, and second, the problem of domestic realism. So both these genres are blended into a collection of novels which feature these kinds of independent, self-reliant woman characters. However, the interesting thing to note is that in the 1890s, there were a lot of hostile critics who violently and very unfairly, it is known today, dismissed these writers. Although these new women writers were inheriting a very respectable literary tradition, that is, the tradition of Elizabeth Gaskell and Charles Dickens, they met very hostile reception in the 1890s. The New Woman novel was dismissed as polemical, pedantic, and thus unartistic. As we will see in a subsequent lecture on Bram Stoker's Dracula, Dracula is actually one of these conservative responses to this New Woman novel. Writing in the Westminster Review on the tyranny of the modern novel, D.F. Hannigan deplored that tendency toward pedantry which appears to beset all women of profound learning and fixed intellectual habits. Now, it's important to note that there were not that many popular women writers at this time, and this is partly to do with the nature of publishing and particularly the preference for racy, sensational styles of writing that the great feminist novels of the mid-century, novels like The Mill on the Floss or Middlemarch, which enjoyed a great deal of prestige in the middle to the second half of the Victorian age, were not found in this decade of the 1890s. The combination of feminism and literature, which had reached a sort of zenith in the work of George Eliot, would not be achieved until a few decades later, until the work of Virginia Woolf becomes more widely read, right? And this is a missed opportunity, a very unfortunate and sad reality of the Victorian era, which nonetheless bears some importance as we continue to track the literary developments in the late Victorian age. While women writers and characters in feminist novels were dismissed as pedantic or polemical, there were some real women who were not and who actually enjoyed a great deal of social respect. One of these was Annie Besant. Annie Besant was active across a range of causes whose interconnections she continually stressed. One-time spouse of an Anglican minister, she renounced both marriage and faith in 1873. Over the next 20 years, she became known as the leading figure in the National Secular Society, the Malthusian Society, which advocated birth control, and the socialist Fabian Society. Besant was a frequent contributor to the radical National Reformer periodical and a co-founder of the Free Thought Publishing Company. She was also a charismatic public speaker. So you can see that there's a stark contrast between the kind of sanction, respect, and influence that Annie Besant enjoyed, despite being radical and feminist, and the fate of the New Woman novelists as well as the protagonists in these New Woman novels. The 1890s is an important decade for the feminist and socialist movements of the time. Annie Besant's career illuminates two important facts about the growth of feminism and socialism in the late Victorian era. The first is that the 1880s and 90s were a time of extraordinarily rich political ferment. At no time since the 1840s had the political landscape in Britain been quite so unsettled. There were a wide range of movements staged by a wide range of different kinds of workers. So, for instance, in the year 1889, gas workers had struck work for higher wages and an 8-hour day. Within a year, 30,000 additional laborers had joined the newly formed National Union of Gas Workers and General Laborers. That same year, 10,000 London dock workers struck for 4 weeks. So, a lot of unionization, a lot of workers getting together, unified by shared interests, shared needs, and challenges, and being able to mobilize, being able to organize and achieve demands. The success of these and other strikes accelerated nascent labor movement. In all, over 200,000 workers joined unions between the years 1888 and 1890. And these are key decades, key years in the growth of the socialist movement in Britain. Two key dates in what has been called the late Victorian Socialist Revival are 1884, which saw the founding of H.M. Hinman's moderately radical Socialist Democratic Federation, and the more mainstream Fabian Society. Second, in the year 1892, James K. Hardy became the first Labour candidate to win a seat in Parliament. And finally, in the year 1893, when the Independent Labour Party was formed under Hardy's leadership. So it's important to note that, and this is the second reason why Annie Besant's career is important, is that it reveals to us, students and scholars of Victorian literature, how deeply involved these writers and figures were in the political and social struggles of the day. It is also to confirm how thoroughly inwoven for them were aesthetics and politics. This kind of interwovenness of politics and aesthetics became most evident in one field of literary production. There was neither prose nor poetry, nor even the popular journalism, but it was British drama. And it was in this decade, the 1890s, that British drama awoke from its long Victorian slumber to become once again a socially engaged art form. And this social engagement of Victorian drama can be seen most powerfully in J.T. Grind's 1891 production of Ibsen's play Ghosts for the Independent Theatre of London. Now, this, for many, was the defining theatrical event of the age. Ibsen would inspire British playwrights such as Shaw, Arthur Wing Pinero, and Henry Arthur Jones, who would write some of the most intellectually challenging and socially engaged British drama that would be written in the history of English literature. Now, from the perspective of modernism, this Victorian development appears very strange. In fact, to modernist successors and critics, this inward turn away from political commitment seemed, for good or evil, the definitive gesture of late Victorian artists, this turn away from politics. However, if one pays close attention to the writing as well as the cultural developments that took place in the 1890s and which I have been tracking in these two lectures, one can see that the turn of the century was far from merely a turn away from politics. In fact, these engagement with politics and the introspection about what society means were central to the work of many late Victorian figures, as writers like Shaw and Morris shows. But more importantly, the career of someone like Annie Besant describes very powerfully the intellectual value of the late Victorian era. I will conclude this discussion of social, political, and economic context of the 1890s by briefly referring to another very, very important, very famous Victorian writer, Thomas Hardy, also a writer that has been discussed in this NPTEL course. Now, I began with what Alfred Austin wrote to celebrate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in the year 1897. I will end by referring once again to what Thomas Hardy was doing in the same year, 1897. In this year, Hardy had traveled to Switzerland to escape the Jubilee. He found himself, by coincidence, staying at the very hotel in Lausanne where many years ago, and virtually on the eve of the French Revolution, Edward Gibbon had written the final works of the history of Rome, that is, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Now, the poem Hardy wrote to commemorate this occasion was Lausanne, and Lausanne very conspicuously avoids the temptation to use Gibbon as an occasion to comment directly on the Jubilee celebrations. Instead, in Lausanne, Hardy conjures up the shade of the historian in order to cast him as the prototype of the modern writer. That is, someone who knows that to tell the truth, one must tell it slant. Now, for Hardy in 1897, this was a difficult time because he was undergoing a transition of his own. And he was undergoing a transition which was in some ways the opposite of the transition that the Victorian literary culture was undergoing. If the Victorian literary culture was undergoing a transition from serious, intellectually oriented writing to popular, more sensational kinds of writing, Hardy was making his own transition from writing novels to writing poetry. And one reason for this transition was the negative reviews of his novels Tess of the Abbeville's and Jude the Obscure. And the Askin phrase, or the move to address reality from a slight angle as against describing it or reflecting it in a realistic mode, therefore made a lot of sense to Thomas Hardy. And it is in Hardy's trajectory from Victorian novelist to modernist poet that we can see the more general turn from public to private utterance that was characteristic of 20th century literature. So the turn from public to private, which modernism usually attributes to Victorian, is actually something that makes both Victorian and modern literatures valuable in themselves. And in response to the Jubilee celebrations of 1897, Hardy did write something, and what he wrote is a strikingly cold and actually distanced elegy for Queen Victoria. This is a poem titled We Are, 1819 to 1901. This does not speak to or for a wider audience, and this poem also does not offer poetic speech as a way to make sense of the flux of history or of the individual life. This is an inward, private, melancholic reflection on the passage of time. Indeed, We Are seems in part an elegy for elegy. And we come to an end of this discussion of what was going on in the 1890s. A strange time, the last epoch in which, or the last unit of literary change in the evolution or the history of Victorian literature. This was a time when the periodical press was growing in popularity. Writers were facing doubts about what kind of stories to tell, and there was a time when the empire itself and the comforts that it brought had begun to feel very, very short-lived. In the midst of these very complex political, economic, and cultural changes, writers decided to embrace some of these changes, and two writers in particular produced some of their most memorable work in the midst of these changes. These two writers are Oscar Wilde and Bram Stoker, and we will now jump into their works and study how these two works represent the best that was thought and written in the Victorian era in the subsequent lectures. Thank you.